This is the story of an ambitious project which was completed 30 years ago, almost to the day. The story of a congregation in its much-loved spiritual home, which had stood on the site of 28 St. John's Wood Road for 60 years, and the decision to demolish it and build a brand new synagogue. The Liberal Jewish Synagogue's first home from 1911 had been a tiny chapel in Hill Street, Marylebone. But as the congregation grew, a new site was acquired opposite Lord's Cricket Ground, and an imposing synagogue with seating for 1,350 people, as well as a large communal hall, offices and library, kitchen and meeting rooms, was completed by 1925. A modern extension with a small synagogue and classrooms was built in the 1960s. During the night of the 1st to the 2nd of November 1940, the synagogue was bombed and severely damaged. The late Marjorie Moose, a long-time religion school teacher, recalls arriving at the LJS the next morning for the service to see the terrible sight of smoke and fire and damage that the bomb had caused the previous night. It was to be another 11 years until repairs were completed, and on the 23rd of September 1951, Rabbi Leo Beck carried the first scroll into the reconsecration service of the restored synagogue. By the early 1980s, however, it was clear that the repairs were inadequate. The leadership of the synagogue faced the massive question of what to do with the damaged building. Many individuals were involved in the decision about how to move forward. Rabbi John Rayner and Rabbi David Goldberg, Zichronam Livracha, had worked alongside each other for more than a decade. And when Rabbi Goldberg became senior rabbi in 1989, he worked closely with the chairman, Sir Peter Lazarus, Zichrono Livracha, to drive forward what was to become a major project. Without their determination and ambition to bring the congregation with them, the rebuilding might never have taken place. Neil Levitt was chairman of the House Committee in the early 80s and eventually became chairman of the Design and Use Committee, overseeing the design of the new synagogue. He remembers having to report the problems in the old building to the council. Invite Neil to, here we go.
The flat roof leaked and one of the main walls had to be repaired on an annual basis. We employed building experts to examine and report on the condition of the building, and their advice was that continual repairs forever would not deal with the problem. This I reported in a long report to council members in 1984.
But how to deal with a building that was structurally unsound and would inevitably bequeath huge costs of maintenance to future generations was a challenge to the leadership and members of the LJS. Different possibilities were put forward in a paper which outlined 3 options. 1, to make do and repair the existing synagogue. 2, to move to a new site and sell the existing building. Or 3, to rebuild on the existing site and provide additional accommodation to be let or sold. The decision was not going to be an easy one. Many of the more established members were not only fond of the old synagogue, which held dear memories for them, they had also invested funds into the original and reconstructed building. Teddy Joseph, one of many generous donors, was worried about the moral issues involved of selling the assets of the synagogue to a developer, assets, he said, for which funds had been raised from our members, past and present. Discussions about the future of the building grew very heated. Rabbi John Rayner, senior rabbi at the time, offered a fourth option to turn the site into a community center with space for a synagogue. A working party seemed sold on redevelopment, and although the idea yielded both support and opposition in the congregation, the decision was eventually taken to enter an agreement with Abbey Housing, finessed by LJS member, the late Tony Margot, Zichrono Livracha, whereby part of the land on which the old synagogue was situated would be sold for £1 million, providing for the shell of the new synagogue, the rest of the money to be raised for the interior design of the synagogue by the community. Neil, how was the idea of redevelopment sold to the rest of the congregation?
Meetings were held for members of the LJS to be told of the council's recommendations, and many of them were dead against it, whilst others pleaded that the wooden surround of the Ark should be retained, as well as the well-known Compton organ. The chairman at the time was Sir Peter Lazarus, and he agreed that every effort would be made to comply with members' wishes.
Trevor Moros was closely involved in the project from the beginning. Trevor, how did you think the congregation could be convinced of such a dramatic project?
What we really tried to do was engender an element of excitement and enthusiasm about the possibility of a renewal, of a modernization of our place of worship. I can remember very clearly trying to convince people that they should think about this as a synagogue in the way in which they think about their own homes, and that we didn't any longer live with lino floors. We had more modern flooring, that there were things we could do to really make this new building an exciting place. And what we were really looking for was a way of accommodating the synagogue for a congregation which was very different to the makeup of the congregation when it was founded. The demographic was different, and way of life was different. And we could, with a leap of faith, do something exciting which would garner people's imagination, and we hoped also revitalize the congregation.
Neil and Trevor were to go on to work closely with the architects, builders, and ancillary firms involved. Trevor, you were part of the interviewing committee to choose the designer for the interior. Do you remember what impressed you about the winning architects for the interior of the synagogue?
From the very beginning, Michael Schwartz had a sense of what we wanted to do. He could see very clearly what the soul of the congregation was about, and he was able to give us a sense that he could really own the feel of the inside of the building. We must remember that at that time there were no new synagogues in the UK. There were very few new religious buildings. I can remember we went on a tour of the Ismaili Center, which the Aga Khan had built a few years before, to get a sense of what it might be like to have a modern place of worship. And what Michael did, particularly with his concept of bringing the Jerusalem stone into the space, with the adaptation of the hexagon, which in a sense wrapped round people. What we were very, very concerned about all along was that this space should be intimate, that this space would feel occupied, even if there were only 50 or 100 people in it. The concept was to try and make this something which we would be very comfortable with as few people, as well as a large congregation, because we were realistic that most of the time there were a few hundred people at the most, perhaps sometimes only tens of people compared to the High Holy Days when we were full. And we wanted to make sure that feeling of intimacy was there, and Michael got that. There was a very clear feeling that he understood what the challenge was.
Michael Schwartz, you were the winning architect of the competition that was put out to look for architects, different architects, for the interior of the building, as opposed to the exterior shell of the building. Tell us about that first trip to London, Michael, when you presented your ideas to the committee.
Shabbat Shalom, thanks for inviting me. Trevor has almost completed saying what I wanted to say, because he explained the concept. I'll just broaden it a bit. It was quite daunting because we were young architects. I'd formed a partnership in London, knowing that if we were to get the project, we'd need architects on the ground, making sure that the project proceeded according to the drawings and so on. We then, at that stage, worked with a very primitive machine called a fax. And we used to do presentations with another primitive machine called an overhead projector. No PowerPoint, no computers. Computers just entered at that stage. Anyway, when we were interviewed that it was a Friday evening, it was with much trepidation. We were young. Then Neil was there, Trevor, and the late Sir Peter Loves, and Prue Baker, etc. And we were a bit nervous, and I shouldn't say we were very nervous, but we were immediately made to feel welcome, and there was such hospitality that was easy to present our concept. What we did present was the whole notion of a synagogue within a synagogue. And actually, that is what we presented, and I think people today can feel that what was built.
And you talked a little bit when we talked earlier about how we'd leave the noisy, chattering world of St. John's Wood Road behind and enter the lobby. Tell us just a tiny bit about that concept of coming in off the street into the sanctuary through the foyer.
Well, the issue of leaving, you walked up the stairs to where the columns were. It was quite noisy. It was sometimes cricket matches on. So there was a lot of clutter and news. But as you entered the doors, left and right, you came into this lovely lobby that today houses the beautiful, splendid Holocaust Memorial. There was chatting, reconnecting after from week to week, and discussing and normal schmoozing. Then you enter the main sanctuary, and what you do is you get there's a little slit in that stucco wall that you get a brief glimpse of the Ark, and then you enter left and right, and you come down aisles that take your eye to the Ark and the Ark wall. And from there, you had basically a slow ritual on entering a place of prayer. I might also say getting that synagogue within a synagogue, that was the biggest dichotomy and the biggest challenge, because we had this 900 plus worshippers during the High Holy Days, and the 40 to 50 regulars on Shabbatot. What Trevor said, how do you reconcile these two extreme conditions? We did it by creating the synagogue within a synagogue, and if you notice, you have a higher bima, the upper bima, and part of that bima slides in to seating for about 40 to 50 people, bringing the rabbi in a more physical and visual contact, and of course spiritual contact with regular congregants, and the congregants feeling close to the rabbi. When it's the High Holy Days, this slides back into the upper bima, and then the rabbis have a bigger vista to the outer synagogue.
So these were the ideas that, Michael, you presented to the congregation, also with the idea of using completely natural materials of wood and stone. And it was in 1988 that a farewell service to the old building was held, and the congregation moved into a disused church in Loudon Road for services. A mezzanine divided the communal hall into two spaces, the upper space for an open plan office and downstairs for kiddushim and meetings. And the religion school relocated to Abercorn School in Abercorn Place for Shabbat morning classes. The congregation was to be in exile for 33 months. Crucial to communication with Michael Schwartz's Jerusalem studio was the association of the London office of Kosky Solomon. Les Kosky was the familiar face at all meetings, early morning, afternoon, and nighttime.
Good morning, Shabbat Shalom, Shana Tova. This is Les. Unfortunately, not live, as it's 3 a.m. in the west coast of the United States, which is where I live now. As a reminder, this was us back then. There I am as Michael Schwartz, my two partners in London, Mark and Richard, and Corby, Michael's partner. At 3 a.m., my contribution would have been moronic, so this is pre-recorded. In high school, I was never very good at Hebrew, and so the guidance of that teacher did not really take hold. My Hebrew teacher did have an oratorial presentation and came into one lesson asking, "What is the longest road?" As we were in Cape Town, someone suggested the road from Cape Town to Cairo, and another, more biblically, the road from Egypt to the Holy Land. "No," the teacher said, "the longest road is the road from theory to practice." Later, in my architectural career, the lesson transformed into process leading to product. Process being something that our practice still holds dear. But it was a couple of months into working with the LJS that I realized how important the process of making a synagogue was to the LJS. Of course, the product would be fine and the congregation would get a synagogue, but that would not be building a synagogue. The design team would produce designs, sketches, and drawings, but I realized that the committee needed ideas, debate, and inclusion, the mortar which would hold the bricks of design together. And so every Tuesday evening, we would review the sketches and discuss ideas and alternatives, and then set the agenda for the following Tuesday. At that time, I lived in West Hampstead, so it was not a chore for me, but I do recall walking home each week with a sense of accomplishment that we had the process right and that the right product would follow, which it did. And for that opportunity, now that I'm retired, I look back with the fondest memories.
Prue Baker, a member of the LJS at that time, was appointed project coordinator and had to manage the requirements of all the different groups within the synagogue. Prue, how did you manage that?
Well, the idea of the job was to have a single person to act as a sort of conduit for the community. The very gifted LJS redevelopment team, headed by Neil and Trevor, and the professional team. It was about ensuring good communication. It wasn't my job to make any decisions, fortunately. And Sir Peter Lazarus was a tremendous support, and he would drop in unexpectedly for coffee from time to time to smoke his pipe and share his current anxieties about the project. My role was to attend every meeting of the community and the professional team, and I remember turning up very early one morning in Camden Town at Kosky Solomon's, clutching a bag of mangoes that I'd picked up in the market on the way in, and Les talking to me about which mangoes I should really have been looking for. And so the meeting went on. But the other aspect you'll all find hard to imagine is documenting everything, minutes and all papers, on a typewriter, and then filing hard copies and posting out everything by post. How many hours would have been saved just a few years later?
And Prue, can you just tell us about why you had to take a group to the Barbican?
Well, sometimes the most unexpected elements of the building caused the most difficulty. At one point, a necessary duct in the side corridor meant there was going to be, it meant introducing a slight slope, and everybody was very angry. So in the end, I suggested we visit the Barbican and test similar inclines in the concert hall foyer. And once we were there, we realized it really wasn't a problem, and ended up the evening convivially at the concert hall bar,
And
tussling out these issues to achieve the best realistic result could sometimes feel uncomfortable. And our wonderful project manager, Chris Hill, had a word for it. "It's called creative tension," he would say. And so it was.
I mean, the other uneasy thing was, although at the beginning you were given an office in one of our members, Tim Simon's offices, but at some point I think you were moved into the empty shell of the building, which must have been a little lonely. And what about health and safety there with you in the concrete shell with one telephone?
Ah, yes, well, Tim Simon had provided me with very generous office space, but there did come a time when it was decided I should move on site, and the building was still a concrete shell, and it did seem very large and very lonely. But from then on, I was privileged to watch the building come alive as the fitting out progressed. And the chair designer, Bob Pulley, wanted the seating to look as though the sanctuary were peopled even when it was empty. And watching the seating one day, watching the seating being brought in, it was indeed like watching the congregation arrive. So there were compensations.
So that the foundation stone ceremony was held in September 1989, with more than a dozen of those who had laid bricks in the original building, laying new ones. And just, Prue, tell us, what about the time capsule?
Oh yes, we introduced a time capsule, or the idea of a time capsule, which the builders called my cooking pot every time they saw me with it. Rabbi Rayner was very sad that the original time capsule was lost. Apparently it was glass, and nobody told anybody, so of course the bulldozers went in and the time capsule went. So this time we wanted to make sure it would last. And it was a good community exercise that everyone could join in. And just after the laying of the foundation stone, Janet Sussman came along and placed the time capsule under a stone nearby, and you can see it today. It's simply marked with the date. And the time capsule includes a letter, the letter to finders, written by Richard Moros, Trevor's son. And if you'd like to know more about the actual contents of the time capsule, you can see that all in the back of the booklet, which is readily available.
Thank you so much, Prue. And what you're seeing on your screen as well now are some of the photographs which were taken by the late Michael Goldhill, the father of Elizabeth Goldhill, now a member of our community, who took some photographs of the building as it was being constructed. And this is the laying of the foundation stone and the laying of the bricks. But of course, it was to be another 16 months before the congregation moved back and some of the synagogue's most striking features would be installed, as well as the Jerusalem stones surrounding the surround to the sanctuary. There were the beautiful Ark Doors, a joint venture with Amit Shur, who was studying jewelry at the Bezalel Academy of Art and Design. Michael, tell us about the Ark Doors and the concept behind those.
Well, the Ark Doors, in a similar way, the Ark Wall, they are supposed to give a textured feeling of the parochet, the covering of the arks, to give the tactile feeling. If you look at a series of diamond-shaped woven materials, starting at the bottom, they are denser and translucent, and as you go up, they get a little less dense and fine nets mesh. So you actually, without seeing the scrolls, you get a glimpse of the pamutim at the top of the scrolls. So there's a bit of a mystery there and so on. But it was Amit Shur's fabricated these panels in Jerusalem. And then a funny story, I brought them in a suitcase. There were 16 of them. I brought them in a suitcase because they were going to be then installed into doors made in Sheffield. Of course, I was pulled aside at the customs at Heathrow, and I opened the suitcase. I tried to explain what a parochet is and what a ark is. They laughed. They didn't believe me, as if I was bringing jewelry, very high-end jewelry into the country. Anyway, they had about 6 or 7 volumes. In order to assess what the value of these panels were, because each were made of various metals. Well, there was a 4 or 5 hour wait there until they completed the task. The payment was made, and then on the way to Sheffield, where they were fabricated.
Michael, just while you've got the floor, so to speak, tell us about your rather surreal experience of being on reserve duty, Miluim, somewhere in the Sinai desert,
Yes.
while you were in the middle of this project, I think.
Well, it actually connects to the parasha of this morning. That's what's a strange coincidence. I had been in London and, doing with Prue Baker and Les and Richard and PCM, the work of going over, ratifying things, redesigning things, and obviously dressed in a tie and suit, which hangs gloriously unused in my Israeli cupboard. What I then flew back to Israel, because I immediately had to do reserve duty. And I was placed on the Egyptian border, patrolling there. I was a medic in the army. And I used to when I was doing my patrolling, I used to have this little radio, and I had an earpiece that I put it in just to break the monotony. And lo and behold, comes on a program on BBC4 on a Sunday. They used to have religious programs. And there's the late David Goldberg giving an explanation of the week's parasha called Vezot Bracha. And it's about Moses still in the wilderness looking into the promised land and how he would never get there. Yeah, I was listening to David Goldberg, who I'd just been sitting with 2 days before. Yeah, I was dusty and looking from the promised land into the wilderness of the Sinai. So it was just a funny coincidence, but very esoteric. It was unbelievable.
Thank you so much. So meanwhile, back in London, the whole project wasn't without its problems, some more serious than others. Neil, can you tell us about the Portico problem?
One of the features of the new design was that the original portico would be kept and used. This included the pillars and the stone from the building, and all of which was carefully dismantled and kept in store. However, a small error occurred when they were eventually restored to the new building. Having rebuilt it, the architect found that it was not in line with the walls of the newly built building, and it had to be taken down and moved some 3 or 4 feet to align the building. But nevertheless, the job was done extremely successfully.
And there was another problem that occurred towards the end of the project that Les Koski is going to tell us about, right on the eve of the dedication service.
Towards the end of the construction, I noticed that the 3 stones surrounding the ark were missing. I asked the stone contractor where they were. Mr. Eller replied, "Where's my $16,000? Mr. Eller had been bugging me for $16,000 so that he could fly his crew back to Israel for a long weekend, something I could not authorize as it was not in their contract. And Chris Hill, our project manager, was nervous that they may not return in time to finish the work. The inauguration date had been set, invitations sent out, and we had a big hole around the ark. I might add that this was at the time of the Lebanon hostage crisis, where Terry Waite had been held for many years. My fear was that the stones were similarly being held hostage. Being bound by the terms of the subcontract, I knew not what to do, so I called Michael. He said, "Leave it to me," and later I learned what that meant. Michael had called Grabelski, Jerusalem's biggest stonemason, and said, "I'm placing an order with you for 3 stones, but do not start production. But you can say that you are taking over the London project from the Eller brothers." Within 3 days, the missing stones had arrived. Saving face by not defaulting on an international project was a higher priority than an extra $16,000. The lesson I carried forward into my business career was that I would never be able to out-negotiate a Middle Easterner.
There was one valued piece of artwork that was incorporated into the new building.
In 1981, one of our members, the late Irvin Seller, donated a vast mural of the 3 pilgrim festivals by the well-known artist William Utermohlen, which was hung in the hall of the old synagogue. Too large for the new hall, the artist was asked to return, and using the mural, converted the original painting to line the wall to the entrance of the sanctuary. It is now a commanding attraction, and even after 30 years, with thousands of congregants passing by, it is still in very good condition.
And Trevor, tell us about your great find with the Ner Tamid. I think you had to go 6,000 miles to get the Ner Tamid to work.
When we started this project, one of the things that was really important to us was that nothing was taken as given, that everything we looked at needed to be looked at afresh. We were not making any assumptions about things that had been done before. And there was a very strong feeling that we should have a real flame in Ner Tamid rather than what is typical, certainly in the diaspora, which is electric lights. And we knew that West London Synagogue had a, sorry, not West London Synagogue, Westminster Synagogue, excuse me, had a Ner Tamid that was fired by oil. So I went along to the Westminster Synagogue and had a look at this Ner Tamid, and it did indeed work with a wick in some form of oil. And I said to the shamus, what do you use for the oil? And he said, mazola, corn oil. So we came back and we decided we would have a competition for somebody to design a ner tamid. And somebody designed the ner tamid and produced it, and it went up. And the way it worked was that you filled the dish with mazola cooking oil and put a wick in it. And it didn't work because nobody had thought about the fact that it was quite drafty up there. And whenever the air conditioning or the cooling or the heating was turned on, the ner tamid blew out. So we had a bit of a problem, and I went around London, David Goldberg and I agonized and agonized. I went to a shop called Whipple, which is where the Church of England clerics buy all their robes and where you buy candles for churches and things, and looked at various options and couldn't find anything. And at that time, I used to go to Los Angeles once a month for a week for work. And one evening during this period, I was sitting in a restaurant in Santa Monica on a slightly windy evening, and on the restaurant table in front of me was a lamp, a fired lamp, a lamp with a flame, and it was windy and it didn't blow out. So I said to the waiter, what they call them in the US those days, server, can you please tell me about this? And he said, oh yes, no, this is a very common restaurant thing. So I bought two and put them in my suitcase and brought them back to London, and it worked. It actually worked. So from then onwards, and if you look at the ner tamid, now you will see it doesn't have a pool of mazola cooking oil. There is a glass vial with a wick, and that glass vial is filled with some kind of paraffin, which we used to have to import from Los Angeles every year in Fred Shelley's time to keep the ner tamid going. So when you see the ner tamid, think about the restaurant in Santa Monica.
Thank you. And Simeon Hartwig, you were 11 years old on the day that we came back into the synagogue on January the 12th, 1991. A last Shabbat service was held at Loudon Road, and the next day the congregation packed into the new sanctuary with great excitement and anticipation and stood waiting for the scrolls to be processed in and placed in the new Ark. Simeon, you were 11 on that day and one of 3 pupils from the religion school invited to light that ner tamid together with the head teacher. What do you remember of that time, Simeon?
I guess every young boy is kind of excited to be invited to light a ner tamid, but I remember we had this transition of being in different synagogues, and as a young guy, it was fun running around, and the actual day of the service, I remember being quite, I guess, proud. Every young boy likes fire, but actually being part of lighting the ner tamid, I very much remember loving the design of the chairs and also the Ark. I think to that day it was probably subconsciously tweaked my interest in kind of exciting design and something different.
Thank you.
But yeah, I think I was very nervous at the same time. I think usually I would be running around probably Trevor Moss's son Dan causing trouble either at the youth club, or kind of upstairs, and usually we'd be kind of watching a service, probably darting a bit in and out. And so I remember it being a proud and important day. I remember my family being big proud of it. So yeah.
And that's on the screen, a very innocent-looking Simeon on the left-hand side, standing next to the Ark that you can see there. I know that when we spoke, Simeon, you said how much you loved looking down from the gallery towards the choir, and talking about the choir, Trevor, the interior of the sanctuary was always designed with the aim that the choir would sing from the hidden choir loft. How did that change occur, Trevor? What kind of impact did it make, bringing the choir down from the hidden choir loft down to sing?
The concept behind the choir loft was, of course, an inheritance from the old synagogue, and it was a very complex thing to design in. We couldn't fit the organ upstairs in the space, so we had to put the organ downstairs. And the idea was that Tim Farrell would sit at the organ in the sanctuary, and there was a TV link to Yaakov Paul, the choir master, the music director, in the choir loft with the choir. But from the very, very first time that we had a service, it became obvious this just wasn't going to work. And we were in a terrible dilemma because we just couldn't think about how we were going to solve this technical problem. And then somehow or other, it occurred to us that maybe what we should simply do is put the choir downstairs and next to the organ. So we did a little bit of reconfiguring of the seating. And I think that from something like the 6th or 7th service onwards, the choir remained downstairs. There was always an assumption that there might be the odd service. And I can remember Rabbi David Goldberg saying that for memorial services, for example, you would want the choir hidden, but actually in practice it never was, and the space which was intended to be the choir lofts became Kathy's office and the music library. What it did do was completely change the nature of LJS services, and probably another of the things that the new building did, which helped us to build the kind of community we now have.
As Rabbi David Goldberg said in his address at the dedication service on January the 13th, 1991, there was still much work to be done. It was Jane Finestone, a member of the LJS, who designed the covers for each of the 8 chairs for the bimah, as well as the chairs in the foyer. And that project was completed in 1992. Jane, can you just tell us very briefly about your vision for these bimah chairs?
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, all good.
Yes.
Yes, good. It began, of course, I did liaise with Bob Pulley on the design of the actual chair itself. And that very, very briefly, I know we don't have a lot of time, the chairs on the bimah also had to represent something. The seating in the congregation helped the way that they were designed to look as if the congregation was full. You're absolutely right. And the ones on the bimah were actually supposed to represent our leaders, our rabbis, the people who sit there, who are not, it should be said, divine, but they are supposed to be better than us and exemplary, leading exemplary lives. And that's what we tried to do. I won't go into the detail now, but that's what they did. My father had always said that the best work is 10% inspiration and 90% perspiration. Well, Project Chairscape, as I called it, became exactly that. From the moment I'd been asked, I had a vision instantly of how it could be. And I presented my concept, and amazingly, there were no objections. So the paintings, the life-size paintings, were traced onto canvas, mounted onto 48 frames. Each tapestry chair was divided into 6 sections, and we had 50 key work stitches, and ultimately 125 overall, and we even had a couple of stitches put in by the local vicar next door. Men, women, children all wanted to contribute a piece of history, stitch-wise. I had also presented this project to the company who had supplied the new carpeting, and that was one of the largest items on our shopping list. They loved it and agreed to supply and hand dye all our tapestry walls. They kept their promise, although they had thought they were only going to be 6 colours. In fact, we had 38, but they did actually honour that. So those chairs can either be viewed as a symbiotic feature in a beautiful place of modern architecture, or they can be understood on another level. There's no time today to explain all that detail, but suffice it to say that every linear contour, every stitch position and colour has a specific symbolism or meaning. In a nutshell, though abstract, they represent the cycle of all life, the cycle of seasons and agricultural harvests, and not least the corresponding Jewish festivals, which actually historically always coincided with a harvest of some sort. It was a labor of love. The workshops, the buffet suppers, the private meetings and tutorials, seemingly never ending, but so heartwarming, and it was indeed self-funded. Synagogue didn't have to pay for that. The stitching began in April 91, final installation was September 92. No one wanted it to end. So in 95, I designed a set of foyer chairs, also with religious symbolism, which so far have survived over 20 years of children's rough and tumble and piles of shopping bags. The passion continued, the stitching, and just to say, from 2011 to 2014, we then got 363 people to complete stitches in 104 cushions, which also reflect and continue the Beamer chair design around the front 3 blocks of congregational seating. And finally, it should be added that the late Ruth Ive and Rachel Corrow, now sadly missed, were key instigators of the original project and also introduced to me Diana Springle, a dear friend and renowned professional embroidery designer who monitored and advised us on all technical aspects all the way through. I feel immensely privileged to have been part of all of this and can't thank everyone enough.
Well, thank you, Jane, and how privileged all of us are to be here. It was to take another 5 years after 1991, after the return of the congregation to number 28, until the community selected an appropriate and powerful memorial to the victims of the Shoah. A committee to select the memorial was chaired by Bob Kirk. Bob, the synagogue always knew it wanted a memorial. What were the committee's aims when you set out to try and choose one?
Well, there was no Shoah memorial in the old synagogue. Now, we felt that really needed to be rectified in the new building. Synagogue Council agreed. The committee started work early in 1989. Our brief, a memorial. Our problem, how to express the unexpressible. We quite quickly established some parameters: simplicity, dignity, non-figurative, in other words, no pietas. And there was also a request for beauty, although how to introduce beauty into something commemorating the Holocaust was a bit of a difficulty. And we knew the location between the doors of the front foyer. Of course, at that time, we were using the front foyer. This was before the days of security. You would come in and get a side view of the memorial, but it would confront you as you came out. We started by inviting 6 artists to submit proposals. Very interesting, but none of them really met our criteria. In general, they were all a bit grandiose, not what we wanted. During the next 4 years, we saw quite a number of submissions, some very interesting, but none that commanded spontaneous and unanimous support. Part of the problem lay in the tension between those on the committee wanting something very simple, mainly the older element, and those happy to go for something a bit more elaborate. Time was passing. We were getting nowhere and rather worried. In the end, a small subcommittee consisting of Rabbi Goldberg, Vicky Slow, Edward Mendelsohn, Neil Levitt, and Les Kosky mounted a very energetic search. They viewed the work of many artists, and then eventually advice from Jeremy Lewison, one of our members, and then associate director of the Tate Gallery, led them to Anish, now Sir Anish Kapoor. Anish's work struck us as spiritual, thoughtful, challenging. It met all our expectations. He so clearly understood the meaning of the word zachor, remember. Anish's original plan was to paint the inside of the stone black, but while working on it, he hit on the idea of polishing the interior. That entirely transformed the effect. Anyone who stood in front of the memorial will know the almost mystical suggestion of movement and shadow within the black void. Of course, one of the advantages of locating the memorial where it is was that it was on an axis with the Ark and the Ner Tamid. You could, through the slit in the wall, you could see from one to the other. And the Ner Tamid does reflect a little bit in the memorial. The idea of simplicity was also the reason for the inscription, Nadarti HaNeder, we have vowed to remember. We started with quite a lengthy text, but decided in the end that this short adaptation of the first line of Avram Shlonsky's poem, The Oath, might encourage reflection and the question, whom and what are we to remember? And that's where education comes in.
But of course, all that was to come much later, including Prue remembering to check with the structural engineers to ensure the floor could take the weight of the 3 tons of Kilkenny limestone. The reaction to the building and the dedication service in January 1991 was encapsulated in a letter written the day after the dedication service by Michael Nathan to Peter Lazarus. Michael, who died just over a month ago at the age of 93, had been a lifelong member of the LJS. Dear Peter, he wrote, yesterday was a wonderfully memorable day for both Jenny and myself, and I'm sure for you and all council members and others who have put so much into providing a really beautiful modern sanctuary for the LJS. We should like to congratulate you and all concerned on providing us with such an inspiring building and to thank you for your hard work in reaching such a happy and successful conclusion to it. And Rabbi Goldberg, who had led the congregation through its exile and whose leadership is associated so closely with the success of the new building, in his address to the congregation on that day in January 1991, concluded with these words, "The Talmud tells us that one should not praise a person in his presence, but I'm going to break that rule in order to single out Sir Peter Lazarus, Neil Levitt, and Trevor Moros, without whose skills, organizational and negotiating abilities, patience, expert knowledge, and unremitting commitment, I seriously doubt whether this great undertaking would ever have reached fruition. We give thanks to all, named and unnamed, who have made today possible. But most of all," he concluded, "of course, we give thanks to God, to whose service this building is dedicated, for having kept us alive to witness this great occasion and be able to take pride in the work of our hands." To conclude this part of our service, I would like to thank all of you who have participated today for your memories and reminiscences, as we celebrate the creativity and work that was invested in our synagogue. As Rabbi Igor said last night in his sermon, today is about celebrating the achievement of our community and its builders who created the beautiful space in which we worship. But however beautiful and magnificent its walls, the LJS is not just a building. It is the people, he said, who matter. It is human achievement and remembrance of the past that are important. As we pay tribute to those who came before us and those who are still with us, to celebrate this achievement, I would like to invite Carol Goldberg to read a prayer to mark this occasion.
30 years ago, on January the 13th, 1991, we rededicated our newly designed sanctuary as a house of God for this community. Today, in our own homes, in exile from the building whose creation and structure many of us witnessed and to which so many contributed in a different and significant way, we give thanks to those who made the vision of a new sanctuary a reality, who labored day after day, week after week, over a period of more than 3 years to create a house of prayer, a house of learning, and place of meeting. We praise the good and generous men and women who have gone before us, as well as those in our midst who labor on behalf of the community. We are grateful to God for the blessing of their lives. May the Eternal One always bless us with such people to lead us from strength to strength. O God, help us to remember that unless you build the house, those who build it labor in vain. Help us to live by your teaching so that our synagogue may be a sanctuary where love and harmony, peace and friendship dwell in accordance with your will and to the benefit of all. And let us say, Amen.